Welcome to Kumbaya Ranch near Crawford, Texas. In 1836, my great-great-grandfather and his family arrived in what was very soon to become the Republic of Texas. As I publish this video in mid-February, we remember 185 years ago at San Antonio de Bejar in an old mission called the Alamo. Surrounded by Santa Anna's army of over 3,000 troops, 104 Texians prepared to give their lives for Texas. Howdy, I'm Jay Miller, KK5IM. Thank you very much for watching this video shack tour. I started fooling around with amateur radio in 1962 as a Boy Scout. Back in those days, we had to learn the Morse code. We had to study and take written tests, usually given to us by older amateur radio operators. So I can't claim to have been licensed continuously since then, but I have been on the air for over 30 years. I earned my amateur extra radio operator's license the hard way by learning to send and receive Morse code at 20 words a minute. I hope you enjoy what follows, and thank you again for watching. What you're about to see is not the work of one man. It's the patience, generosity, wisdom, and friendship shown me by a group of men, some now silent keys, who for some reason took me under their wings and showed me the way. Although I built most all of what follows, it was the efforts of a core group of extremely gifted and talented guys that I'm proud to call my friends that made it all possible. Any accolades are mainly due them. I was but the instrument of their knowledge. But above all, my wife Lainey has supported and put up with this rabble and the rabble from my other hobbies and interests for 35 years. I remain the luckiest man alive. Well, welcome to the electronics lab here at KK5IM. Well, there's never really enough room, and we continue to acquire and accumulate material and junk and parts. I do try and keep things fairly well organized. I built an awful lot of stuff here, and I guess in ham radio, one of the biggest things that I enjoy most is homebrewing and building equipment. Along this wall, there's all the tubes that we use in the radios that we have now. I have spares for just about everything in the shack, and they're all here. If we don't find it here, there are boxes elsewhere that have plenty of extra tubes in them. This is a Model 19 teletype. It was given to me by my good friend W2CQH, Reed Fisher. I cleaned it up, restored it, got it operational. It's now receiving teletype information off the internet from an outfit called ITTY. That's a Raspberry Pi sitting on top of the TNC. In my long photographic career, I started out in college doing wire service photography for both United Press International and the Associated Press. And my dad was a pioneer newspaper photographer in Texas. And once you get the sound of a teletype in your blood, it never really goes away. One of our techs at UPI gave me that United Press International sign almost 50 years ago, and it found a home on this Model 19. About the greatest thrill I get in ham radio is building equipment. I've always enjoyed it. I think I'm fairly good at it. I need a lot of help, and especially from my friends on 7203. But all the parts and all the screws and hardware and capacitors and resistors are all here. Just about anything I need. I've built a lot of stuff here. I have a lot of tools and a lot of test equipment. I wish I knew how to use most of the test equipment, but I can get by. Sometimes it's a little dangerous, but usually a FaceTime call with one of the guys solves most of the problems. My shack measures about 24 by 16 feet. I built all of the operating desks and the center console. Each wall is on a separate circuit with 120 and 240 volt outlets. This panorama shot was made before I finished the 813 transmitter, which is now in the RCA rack to the left of the TDO transmitter. Otherwise, the picture is current. We'll go around the room on our tour. My latest construction project is what I call the RAN or RAN transmitter. This rig uses a digital chip exciter with a 1625 power amplifier. Any of 4 oscillator frequencies in the 75 meter phone band can be selected. The idea was to use pre-programmed oscillator chips instead of crystals. The exciter feeds a single 813 power amplifier. The modulator uses a pair of 811As and a modulation transformer from an ART13. The speech amplifier is also based on the ART13. The high voltage power supply, named the Blue Piglet, can deliver 2,000 volts to the modulator and PA. Moving along the east wall of the shack, we see some of the artifacts and treasures I've collected, as well as a small portion of my extensive library of technical books. My late mentor, J.B. Jenkins, W5EU, gave me his entire library before he passed away. In the center of the room is a console containing the master power control panel, a computer, a K3 and an alpha, a 51J3 receiver, and the TDO remote control panel. The station master power panel shows the status of AC primary and 12 volt DC circuits. The 2 red and green push buttons operate a heavy-duty relay which switches all AC power to the shack on or off. The big red button is for emergency use only. I'm a Mac person. This PC hates me, and the feeling is mutual. Old buddy Chuck, AE4CW, keeps it relatively tamed for me. The Elecraft K3 is my only modern radio. I use it from time to time along with the Alpha 76A 3-holer amplifier. I built the monitor panel using a Heathkit scope and a Collins coupler. The Collins 51J3 is the receiver for the TDO transmitter, and the remote control panel operates the TDO. I use an amplified D104 mic on the big machine. My military radio collection nests neatly into this station console I built. Most of this stuff actually works, but due to current band conditions, their low power output doesn't work well. Along the top are miscellaneous items, including some spare mics, a few ARC units, and a Nazi-era Volksempfänger. That alone is a separate story. On the bottom shelf are the power supplies for the TCS, ART13, and big 24 volts for auto tunes. We'll cover the antenna system controls at the far right in a few minutes. In the left bay are speakers, a Collins Auto-Tune R105 receiver, which is linked to the ART13, and a pretty rare Collins ARC2A auto-tuned receiver. In the center are a brand new TCS receiver, the ART13 transmitter, and a Collins 212Y remote amplifier for the ART13. The TCS transmitter is at top right. Note the handmade connecting cables. The Hammerland SP600 is also available for the ART13. A pair of Bird coax switches select the transmitters and receivers for this station. A pair of fully restored Collins S-lines make up stations 1 and 2. At the top is a 312B3 speaker with a 516 F2 power supply, a 32 S1 transmitter, a 312B4, and a 75 S1 receiver. On the bottom row are a Bird watt meter, a custom-made Heathkit monitor scope, a 32 S3 transmitter, a 312B4, and a 75 S3C receiver. The mic is an Static 10D. The S3 line is connected to a beautiful Collins 30 S1 linear amplifier. These two stations feature Collins KWM2 transceivers. On the top is a reproduction Collins SC301 station console I made. The original was never brought to production. A KWM2, a 312B4, and a 30L1 linear amplifier. On the bottom is a 55G1 preselector speaker for the 51S1 receiver next to it. This receiver belonged to Art Collins and was given to me by his widow. Next is a KWM2A, a 312B4, and another of my Heathkit Collins look-alike monitor scopes. At far right is a Shark & Skinner linear amplifier I built. A pair of 400 tubes with a 3500 volt power supply delivers legal limit on 20, 40, and 80 meters. I made this handoff board for our morning sideband net on 7203. K0BS, WB5WUX, K9LOF, and I started this group over 20 years ago. Since then, we brought the rest of the guys aboard and greatly enjoy everyone's daily participation. J.B. Jenkins restored this 1930s vintage Collins 30J16 from nothing but the cabinet and the output network deck. He offered it to me a year or so before he passed, on one condition, that I would replace the nearly impossible to find C101 finals with 813s. With a great deal of help from Butch and Mac, I did so by manufacturing a completely new RF chassis. The rig is used only on a 160-meter phone. I was able to work JB on it. It was probably his last amateur radio QSO. The frequency oscillator for the 30J is a Collins PTO unit I built for an earlier project. Stations 8 and 9 here are operated from these desktop racks. On the left is the speaker, watt meter, and antenna control for the 30J, the PTO, and a Collins 51J4 receiver. In the center rack is an REA modulation monitor that can monitor all three big AM transmitters. A patch panel allows connecting the audio to either the 30J or the 813 transmitter. The Collins 12Z remote amplifier delivers line-level audio from a couple of broadcast mics. The mic with the KGNC flag is an RCA KB2C and came from that station in my hometown of Amarillo, Texas. Wayne, N5WMK, made the mic base for me. A Collins R390A receiver is used for the 813 transmitter. W4AX blueprinted the rig, and it is absolutely perfect inside and out. In 1962, I dreamed of the one-band kilowatt transmitter featured in the ARRL handbook of that year. My dream finally came true when I built it. Comprised of a modulator and high-voltage power supply, WB5WUX, salvaged from an old transmitter, I built the rest. As usual, Mac, Butch, and Reed got it working over one guy's weekend. A pair of 813s in the PA are driven with a simple crystal-controlled exciter to about 350 watts. The modulator uses a pair of 572Bs. The rig's construction was featured in issue number 370 of Electric Radio magazine in March 2020. I even found the original designer who built the first rig. I use this transmitter most frequently on 3885. The Collins 16F14 transmitter is part of a Navy Air Force ground-to-air communications system that the Navy called Unit TDO. George Donovan rescued this fine example and it made its way to Crawford in 2011. This unit was built in 1944 and reconditioned by the U.S. Navy at Mare Island Shipyard in the early 1950s. It had been packed in a crate securely for 50 years. Weighing in at 1,200 pounds and 6 feet tall, it's a big machine. 10 channels of auto-tune are assignable from 2 to 18 megahertz. With two 813s in the final, modulated by a pair of 805s, she puts out over 300 watts on AM phone. You can think of it as an ART-13 on steroids. The auto-tune mechanism itself is a work of mechanical engineering art. The rig functions extremely well, but we've not completely adjusted the auto-tune system. Let's talk about the antenna farm here at KK5IM. In this night shot, you get a pretty good idea of our antennas and layout. The 40 by 80 man cave building is in the center. In the foreground is a 70-foot tall north tower for the 300-foot dipole. The dipole is oriented due north and south. The south tower is just barely visible in the far left background. Lit with a spotlight at the base of its crank-up tower, the Force 12 C4XL beam really stands out. The Force 12 C4XL sits atop a 60-foot tall crank-up tower. At the apex is a 2-meter vertical. The beam has two feed lines, one for 10, 15, and 20 meters, and one for 40 meters. The Delta 2 40-meter add-on kit gives two 39-foot elements on 40 meters. The boom length is 30 feet. The rotor is an old tail twister. All three feed lines and the rotor control lines are bundled and run down the tower and over to a NEMA enclosure. At this point, the coax lines and the rotor control cable run through polyphasers for lightning protection. All cables then run underground into the shack. Old pal Butch, K0BS, used this tower for many years in the frozen north. We rebuilt the lifting winch and recabled the tower before we erected it. Note there is 120 volt power available at the post. My wire dipole is used only for 75 and 160 meter phone. Stretched almost 300 feet between two 70-foot tall towers, the antenna is fed with heavy-duty ladder line. The north tower is a RON HDBX self-supporting tower. The south tower is RON 25 and guide at 3 points. Both towers have winches to raise and lower the antenna. We plan to replace the ladder line with true open wire line this fall. The ladder line itself is supported 2 feet above the man cave metal roof and terminates in a pair of Dipole insulators with horn gaps on each wire. This feeds through the building wall into the shack. I hired a sign company to erect the towers under K0BS's supervision. It only took them an hour, as we had pre-assembled and prepped the towers themselves. It was the best $500 investment I've ever made. Now that we've examined the exterior part of our antenna farm, let's take a look at what happens when it comes in the shack. Okay, from the Dipole insulators here, the feed line comes down to this first rather nasty looking knife switch. As you can see, it's in the safe position at this moment. That means that the conductors are directly grounded to the common point. And I'll explain the common point in a few minutes. To operate, you obviously throw the switch to operate. That brings the RF current from this switch over to this other knife switch. This knife switch can switch to the 75 meter coupler or the 160 meter coupler. I'll explain those in just a few minutes. So these two watt meters are in the line depending on which coupler is selected. Now this switch, these bird switches here, can connect any of the antennas to any of the 12 positions in the shack. There are 10 stations in here, and this is number 11 down here, which is used if you bring a radio in from a ham fest or from a friend and you want to check it out. You do it right here. Number 12 is in the lab next door, so you can connect any type of antenna or project you're working on to whatever project you're working on. But to operate these switches, you pull them, turn them to the position you want, and push. So these are the antennas. This is station 7 through 12. This is station 1 through 6. And this particular one switches between these two switches because they didn't have a 12-position bird. I fabricated the panel, did the custom dry transfers, and a friend of mine who has an engraving shop did the old-fashioned engraving on plastic for that panel. These are the Homebrew balanced antenna couplers. Notice it's a coupler, not a tuner. Their main function is to take the 450 ohm ladder line and change the impedance to 50 ohms. And it does that with a series of components in here, and I'll show you a close-up. As you can see, they're extremely well built. K0BS designed them, and I built them. They're both floating on wood and totally isolated from any metal. Notice the clips on the coil on the 160 meter coupler, which allows us to change the link to suit whatever we might need to use. They're very sensitive, and we don't have a great deal of bandwidth. So at the moment, the 75 meter coupler is set for the high end of the phone band, 3880 to about 3895. I think they'll handle anything I can throw at it. One very important thing I'd like to address for a moment is the issue of what's known in the broadcasting trade as a common point. Behind this rack mount is a plate of copper. All of the feed lines, with the exception of ones from the Dipole, come into this common point. They're all grounded at that point. The shields are all grounded at that point. The copper strap, about 1.5 inch copper strap, runs all the way around the shack. Everything is tied to that. Then it is tied to that copper plate, which goes to a single point ground, which is 3/4 inch cable, copper cable that is all the way around the perimeter of the 40 by 80 foot building. It's CAD welded to the building shell itself, and then to as much ground rods as we could get in the rocky soil out here. The copper strap, the big copper strap, runs also to the crank-up tower, and it runs out to tower number 1, the north tower. Eventually we may put a vertical on that. But the importance of common point ground for RF, this has nothing to do with earth ground for safety ground, but is to bring all the RF grounds to one single point, i.e. the common point. Well, that's about it. I hope you enjoyed the tour, and thanks very much for watching. I see by the geochron clock over there, it's about time for some bourbon and branch. The smoker's been running all day, and I bet you Laney's got a really great barbecue spread ready to eat. Y'all come see us, okay?